The mist clung to the hollows like a shroud, wrapping the ancient oaks in veils of grey that whispered secrets to those who dared listen. In the year 1875, deep in the shadowed heart of Appalachia, where the mountains rose like jagged spines against a bruised sky, the Harlan farmstead stood as a sentinel of forgotten sins. Elijah Harlan, a man carved from the same unyielding stone as the ridges around him, ruled his kin with an iron fist and a Bible scarred by fire. His sons, Jacob, Thomas, and young Caleb, tended the rocky soil by day, their hands blistered and their eyes downcast, but at night, when the wind howled through the pines like distant cries, they felt the weight of something unseen pressing in. Elijah had come to this forsaken place years ago, fleeing whispers of scandal from the valleys below, but the woods had their own tales to tell. Lately, the voices had grown bolder, slithering from the underbrush after dusk, murmuring of blood and bonds that must not break. They spoke to him alone at first, in fragments that chilled his marrow. Bind them close, the line must endure, or the dark will claim all. He dismissed them as fever dreams from the ague that swept the hills, but as the leaves turned crimson and fell like drops of blood, the urgings became commands he could no longer ignore. One autumn eve, as the sun bled into the horizon, Elijah gathered his boys in the dim glow of the cabin's hearth. The fire crackled uneasily, casting long shadows that danced like specters on the rough-hewn walls. "The world out there is rot," he growled, his voice a rumble like thunder over the peaks. "But here, in our blood, lies strength. A secret pairing, handed down from our forebears, to keep us pure against what's coming." The sons exchanged glances, unease knotting their guts, but obedience was etched into their bones like the scars from his belt. Little did they know, as the first frost etched patterns on the windowpanes that resembled twisted veins, that these pairings would weave a web of horror, birthing a bloodline twisted by forces older than the mountains themselves. The voices waited patiently in the dark, hungry for what would unfold, their echoes growing into a chorus that promised revelations to shock the soul in the shadowed folds of Appalachia, where the mountains stood like ancient guardians cloaked in eternal mist. The year 1875 marked a time when the world beyond the ridges felt impossibly distant. The Harlan family had carved out their existence in a narrow hollow deep within the Cumberland Plateau, a place so remote that even the hardiest travelers from the coal camps or river valleys seldom ventured near. Their farmstead, a cluster of rough log cabins, a sagging barn, and fields scraped from stubborn clay, sat nestled against a dense wall of oak, hickory, and hemlock that seemed to swallow sunlight whole. To reach it, one followed a winding trace barely wide enough for a mule, a path that twisted through laurel thickets so tangled they were called hells by locals, and across creeks that ran black with tannin from fallen leaves. Elijah Harlan, the patriarch, had chosen this isolation deliberately. A tall, raw-boned man with a beard like iron filings and eyes the color of winter storm clouds, he had arrived in the holler nearly 2 decades earlier, bringing with him a young wife who died in childbirth soon after, leaving him with 3 sons and a silence that grew heavier with each passing season. Elijah spoke little to outsiders, and when revenue men or circuit preachers came too close, he met them at the edge of his land with a long rifle cradled in his arms and a stare that sent them retreating without a word. His boys, Jacob, Thomas, and little Caleb, learned early that the world beyond the woods was a place of corruption and weakness, full of soft men who bowed to laws written by distant strangers. Here, in their hollow, only God and blood mattered, and Elijah intended to keep both pure. Yet even in this self-imposed exile, whispers followed the Harlans. Old-timers down in the settlements spoke of a curse tied to the land itself, a story passed along in hushed tones around hearth fires, that something ancient and hungry had been disturbed when the first white settlers cleared the ridges, and that it demanded payment in blood and secrecy to remain appeased. Elijah dismissed such tales as superstition, the idle chatter of drunkards and granny women, but late at night, when the wind rattled the chinking between the logs and the dogs refused to bark at shadows moving between the trees, he felt the weight of unseen eyes upon the cabin. The forest around them was not merely silent, it listened. And lately, in the deepest hours before dawn, Elijah had begun to sense that the listening had turned to waiting, patient and implacable, for the family to fulfill a bargain they had never knowingly made. The isolation he had enforced to protect his own now felt less like a fortress and more like a trap slowly tightening around them all. As the nights grew longer in that forsaken holler, Elijah Harlan found himself waking long before the roosters stirred, his body rigid beneath the patched quilts while the cabin creaked around him like an old man shifting in his sleep. At first he blamed the ague that clung to the low places after heavy rains, or the ache in his joints from years of wrestling stone and stump from the earth. But soon he could no longer deny that something else was pulling him from slumber, soft murmurs that drifted through the chinks in the walls, threading themselves into his dreams until they became indistinguishable from waking thought. The voices came only after the fire had burned down to embers and the boy's breathing had settled into the slow rhythm of exhausted sleep. They rose from the direction of the deep woods that pressed against the backfield, where the ground dipped into a ravine no one in the family had ever fully explored. At first they were no more than fragments carried on the wind, a low hum like bees trapped under a bucket, or the faint rustle of leaves when no breeze stirred the branches overhead. Elijah would sit up in the dark, heart hammering against his ribs, straining to make sense of the sounds. He told himself it was owls calling across the ridges, or water dripping from the eaves, anything but what his deepest instincts warned him they truly were. But as autumn deepened and the frost began to silver the pumpkin vines, the fragments knit themselves into words. They spoke his name Elijah in a tone both intimate and commanding, as though an old kin long buried had returned to settle a debt. Then came the promises, strength for his line, protection from the sickness that had taken his wife and so many others in the valleys below, power drawn from the very bones of the mountain if only he would listen. The voices urged him toward one thing above all, purity. Bind them close, they whispered, the syllables slithering through the cracks like smoke. The blood must not thin. The line must endure, unbroken, or the dark beneath will rise and swallow all you hold. Elijah fought the words at first, pressing his palms to his ears until the nails bit into his scalp, reciting psalms under his breath until his throat grew raw. He was a God-fearing man, or had been once, and he knew the shape of temptation when it wore a familiar voice. Yet each night the chorus returned stronger, patient as roots splitting stone, weaving images into his mind of a family unbroken by the frailties that felled lesser men, children who would never know hunger, sickness, or the weakness of diluted blood. The voices promised that hidden beneath the farmstead, locked in the earth since the first Harlan set foot on the ridge, lay something ancient and potent waiting to be claimed, but only if the blood remained pure enough to bear it. By the time the first hard freeze locked the creek in glassy silence, Elijah no longer covered his ears. He sat in the dark, head bowed, listening as the whispers curled around him like tendrils of frost, and felt the last of his resistance crumble under their relentless weight. The voices had chosen him, they said, because he alone understood the cost of survival in these unforgiving hills. And he, in the cold solitude of those endless nights, began to believe them. On a night when the wind scraped the cabin roof like claws seeking entry, Elijah rose from his pallet without lighting the lamp. The embers in the hearth had collapsed into a dull red glow that painted the room in blood-tinted shadows, enough for him to find what he sought. From beneath a loose floorboard near the chimney he drew a thin, oilskin-wrapped bundle that had lain hidden since the day he first claimed the holler. Inside was a book no larger than a hymn book, its cover fashioned from dark leather that felt unnaturally cool to the touch, the spine cracked and bound with sinew rather than thread. He carried it to the rough-hewn table, sat on the bench his grandfather had carved, and opened it with hands that trembled not from cold. The pages were brittle, inked in a cramped hand that shifted between English and symbols Elijah could not name, yet somehow understood when the firelight flickered across them. What he read there rooted him to the spot, breath shallow, as the voices that had haunted his nights suddenly fell silent, as though satisfied to watch. The book chronicled the Harlan line farther back than any family Bible dared, names scratched beside crude drawings of the ridge, of circles marked in stone, of pairings that made his stomach lurch even as recognition dawned. It spoke of a covenant struck when the first of their blood spilled upon the soil, strength granted in exchange for closeness, power fed by the refusal to let outsider blood dilute what the mountain had chosen. Each generation, it claimed, had obeyed in secret, brother with sister, cousin with cousin, father guiding son, until the line grew potent enough to hear the voices clearly and command what slept below. Those who wavered, the pages warned in faded brown ink, brought ruin upon the rest. Elijah read until the eastern sky began to pale, until the words burned behind his eyes like brands. When at last he closed the book, the silence of the cabin felt different, charged, expectant. He wrapped the tome once more and returned it to its hiding place, But the knowledge remained, heavy as a millstone around his neck and yet strangely buoyant, as if a burden long carried alone had finally been named. Later that same evening, after the boys had eaten their cornbread and beans in weary quiet, Elijah banked the fire high and called them close. The flames leapt, throwing grotesque shapes across their faces, Jacob's sharp and wary, Thomas's guarded, Caleb still round with boyhood. Elijah's voice, when it came, was low and steady, the tone he used when speaking of scripture or the handling of a loaded rifle. "There's a charge laid upon us," he began, eyes fixed on each son in turn. "Older than this land was named Kentucky, older than the treaties or the wars. Our strength, our survival, it don't come from plows or powder alone. It comes from keeping the blood strong, the way our fathers kept it before us." He paused, letting the crackle of pine knots fill the hush. "The book shows the way. Pairings, close as the Lord allowed in ancient days, to hold what's been promised us." With the book returned to its hiding place, Elijah wasted no time. The voices had quieted, but their silence felt like approval, a held breath waiting for obedience. He chose Jacob first, the eldest at 22, broad-shouldered from years of felling timber and strong enough to bear what was coming without breaking. Jacob had always been the quiet one, the son who asked few questions and swung the axe hardest when anger needed an outlet. Elijah watched him now across the supper table, noting the set of his jaw, the way his eyes flicked up only when spoken to directly. One frost-rimed morning, before the younger boys stirred, Elijah led Jacob out past the corn stubble to the old smokehouse that stood apart from the main cabin, its chinking long fallen away so the wind moaned through the gaps. Inside, the air hung thick with the ghost of cured hams and the sharper tang of something older. Elijah shut the plank door behind them, slid the iron latch, and spoke without looking at his son. "The line starts with you," he said, voice flat as creek ice. "There's a girl down in the lower field, your cousin Ruth, come up from your mother's people 2 seasons back. Quiet, strong stock. You'll pair with her tonight, and again as needed till the seed takes." Jacob stood motionless, the cold seeping through his homespun shirt, his breath clouding in the dim light that leaked between the logs. He had noticed Ruth working the distant garden patches, her dark hair tied back, her movements quick and sure, but she was kin, close enough that the valley preachers would have called it abomination. Yet the weight of his father's gaze pinned him like a trap, and the memory of the belt across his back in boyhood rose sharp and immediate. That night, under a moon thin as a scythe blade, Elijah walked Jacob across the frozen furrows to the small lean-to where Ruth had been quartered alone. She waited inside, face pale but composed, eyes lowered. Elijah had spoken to her earlier, promising protection for her younger siblings still down in the settlement if she complied. No tears, no pleas, only the hush of submission that mountain life beat into the bones of women early. Elijah lingered at the threshold long enough to ensure the door was barred from outside, then turned back toward the cabin, the crunch of his boots the only sound in the brittle air. Months passed in uneasy rhythm. Jacob spoke even less than before, his gaze sliding away whenever Ruth crossed the yard with water buckets or armloads of firewood. When her belly began to round beneath her apron, Elijah nodded once in satisfaction and kept closer watch on the woods at night, as if listening for approval that never quite came. Then, on a raw March evening when the thaw turned the paths to mire, Ruth's time arrived sooner than expected. The birth was hard, the cabin filled with her muffled cries and the sharp smell of blood. When the child finally slid into Elijah's waiting hands, slick and squalling, he lifted it toward the lamp flame and froze. The infant's eyes, wide and unblinking even in the sudden light, gleamed an unnatural pale gray ringed with black, like river stones polished by something deeper than water. They fixed on Elijah with a knowing that no newborn should possess, and for the first time since the voices began, a chill settled in his gut that had nothing to do with the mountain cold as the years turned in the holler. The pairings became a shadowed rhythm, unspoken yet inescapable, woven into the fabric of daily toil. Elijah's commands grew more insistent, the book consulted in secret before each new decree, the voices in the woods a constant murmur of encouragement that only he could hear. Thomas was drawn in next, paired with a distant cousin brought up from the creek bottoms under pretense of help with the harvest, and then young Caleb, barely past boyhood, when another branch of kin was summoned with promises of shared land that Elijah never intended to keep. The women came and went like ghosts, housed in outbuildings, their bellies swelling in turn, their their eyes averted from the brothers who had once been playmates in the creek. The children born of these unions were kept close, raised in the main cabin or the loft above the barn, nursed by their mothers until weaned and then passed to whichever hands could tend them while the fields demanded attention. At first they seemed no different from any mountain young, scrawny limbs, dirt-streaked faces, cries that echoed off the ridges at dusk. But as seasons passed and the blood mingled deeper, subtle strangeness took root. The eldest, Jacob's gray-eyed son named Amos, spoke his first word not to his mother but to the wind rattling the shutters, answering a question no one had asked aloud. By the time he could toddle, he wandered to the edge of the woods alone, standing motionless for hours as though listening to conversation just beyond human hearing. When called back, he returned with leaves clutched in tiny fists that never withered, no matter how long they lay on the hearthstone. Ruth's second child, a girl called Lottie, woke the household one midnight by laughing at shadows that danced without firelight to cast them, her eyes reflecting the same pale ring as her brothers. The younger ones followed suit. Thomas's firstborn could find water with a peeled peach twig where no spring had ever run, guiding Elijah's spade to seep that saved the corn in drought years. Caleb's daughter, still nursing, quieted only when carried to the ravine's edge, cooing at the dark between the trees as though greeted by kin. All of them shared the same unsettling gaze, irises ringed with black, pupils wide even in sunlight, and all of them turned their heads in unison when the wind shifted from the deep woods, as if called by name. The farmstead grew quieter in other ways. Dogs that once barked at coons refused to cross certain fence lines after dark. Chickens laid eggs with double yolks more often than not, but the roosters crowed backward, toward the west at dawn. Elijah watched these signs with a mixture of triumph and unease, for the voices praised each new birth in tones that slithered warmer around his mind, yet the children's abilities sharpened faster than the book had foretold. They heard things he could not, repeated fragments of whispers he recognized only in dreams, and sometimes, when gathered together on the porch steps, they fell silent all at once and stared toward the tree line with expressions too knowing for their years. Isolation tightened like a snare. Visitors, rare enough before, stopped coming altogether, turned back by tales filtering down to the settlements of strange lights seen on the ridge or cries that sounded almost human echoing from the holler. The family drew inward, bound not just by Elijah's rule but by the growing sense that the world beyond the laurel thickets could no longer understand what they were becoming. The children, especially, seemed less tethered to the cabin and fields, their bare feet carrying them closer each day to the shadowed places where the voices originated, drawn by an inheritance awakening in their veins. Thomas Harlan had always been the watcher among the brothers, the one whose eyes lingered a fraction longer on the edges of things, cataloguing what others missed. Where Jacob swung the axe in grim silence and Caleb trailed behind like a shadow, Thomas moved quietly through the chores, noting the way the new children tilted their heads toward the woods or how Elijah's lips moved soundlessly some nights as he stared into the fire. He asked no questions aloud, but the questions piled up inside him like stones in a cairn, marking paths he dared not yet follow. One late summer afternoon, when the heat shimmered above the corn and Elijah had ridden down to the distant mill with a sack of grain, Thomas slipped away from the field earlier than usual. The younger children were napping in the shade of the porch, their strange eyes closed for once, and the women tended the kettle in the yard. He climbed the peg ladder to the attic above the main cabin, a place rarely visited since the rafters were low and the air thick with dust and mouse sign. Sunlight leaked through knotholes in the shingles, striping the plank floor in pale bars that revealed what careful feet had hidden. Beneath a pile of yellowed quilts and moth-eaten army coats from the late war, Thomas found a cedar box bound with rusted wire. The lock had long since crumbled, and when he lifted the lid the smell of camphor and old blood rose sharp enough to sting his eyes. Inside lay bundles wrapped in oilcloth, small, limp shapes no larger than a man's hand. He unwrapped the first with fingers that would not stop trembling and found himself staring at a preserved infant, skin darkened and leathery, limbs twisted inward like the roots of a stunted sapling. The skull was elongated, the mouth fused into a lipless seam, eyes reduced to blackened pits. A scrap of paper pinned to the swaddling bore a date 20 years past and the name of a sister Thomas had never known existed. One by one he uncovered the others, 5 in all, each more malformed than the last, some with extra digits fused like flippers, one with a ridge of bone protruding from the spine like the beginning of wings. The dates spanned generations, careful ink noting which pairings had birthed them and how quickly they had been returned to the earth before outsiders could see. The final bundle held only fragments, tiny finger bones tied with twine, and a longer note in Elijah's own hand describing a birth that had taken the mother with it, the child too eager for the voices, come out speaking in tongues no Christian ear could bear. Thomas sat back on his heels amid the dust motes, the attic suddenly colder despite the heat trapped under the roof. The pieces he had hoarded in silence, the children's unnatural eyes, their affinity for the ravine, the way Elijah consulted the hidden book with growing desperation, all slotted into place with a click that echoed in his chest. What he had taken for promises of strength looked now like a ledger of failures, hidden away so the next generation would not refuse the command. The voices his father served had not been content with mere obedience, they demanded escalation, each pairing a gamble that the blood might finally prove worthy, no matter the cost in ruined flesh concealed beneath the floorboards. He wrapped the bundles again with care, returned the box to its grave of quilts, and descended the ladder as though the rungs might give way beneath the new weight he carried. Outside, the cicadas droned on, oblivious, while Thomas stood in the yard and felt the first threads of quiet rebellion tighten around his heart, thin as spider silk yet stronger than any chain Elijah had ever forged. A fierce nor'easter barreled down from the northwest in the autumn of 1881, stripping the ridges bare and turning the holler into a cauldron of howling wind and lashing rain. The storm struck without warning, bending the ancient oaks until their roots groaned and flooding the creek until it roared like a living thing trying to tear free of the mountain. Inside the cabin, the family huddled close to the hearth, the younger children wide-eyed and clinging to their mothers while Elijah paced the plank floor, his face drawn tight as he listened to the gale. The voices, silent for weeks, returned that night with a fury that matched the tempest outside. They poured into Elijah's mind in overlapping waves, no longer whispering but demanding, their tone edged with something close to hunger. More, they insisted, the word repeating until it drowned out the thunder. The vessel weakens. Bind again. Now. Before the gate closes. He clutched the arms of his chair until the knuckles blanched, sweat beading on his brow despite the drafts slicing through the chinking. The book had warned of such moments, times when the power beneath the ridge stirred and required fresh tribute lest it withdraw entirely. Driven by the clamor in his skull, Elijah roused the household long after midnight. The storm made secrecy impossible, lightning illuminated the yard in stark white flashes as he herded Jacob and Thomas toward the barn loft where another cousin, Miriam, had been kept since spring. She was heavy with child already, but the voices cared nothing for that. Elijah's commands came sharp and breathless, his eyes reflecting the firelight with a fevered glaze none of the sons had seen before. Jacob resisted for the first time, a low protest lost beneath the wind, but Elijah's rifle barrel pressed cold against his spine ended the argument. The loft door slammed shut behind them, the latch driven home with a sound like a coffin lid closing. Hours later, as the storm began to slacken into a steady, mournful rain, a different cry rose above the drip from the eaves. Miriam's labor had come too soon, triggered by terror and exhaustion. The women worked by lantern light while the brothers stood helpless in the downpour outside, faces turned away from the loft windows. When the child finally emerged, it drew only a single, wet gasp before falling silent. Miriam followed moments later, her blood soaking the straw until the lantern's glow turned the floor black. Elijah carried the tiny, still form down the ladder himself, wrapping it in a feed sack without a word. He dug the grave at the edge of the ravine just before dawn, the soil soft from the deluge, the voices finally quieting to a satisfied hum as the first shovelful of earth thudded down. When he returned to the cabin, mud to his knees and rain streaming from his beard, he looked suddenly older, the lines around his eyes carved deeper by the flickering lamp. The family watched him in silence, the air thick with the smell of blood and wet wool, none daring to speak the questions burning behind their teeth. From that night onward, the storm's aftermath lingered not in broken branches or washed-out paths, but in the hollow spaces it left behind. Miriam's absence from the breakfast table, the empty cradle in the corner, the way Elijah now flinched at sudden silences as though expecting the voices to return louder than before. The demand for purity had claimed its first open sacrifice within the family itself, and the holler seemed to hold its breath, waiting to see what fresh bindings would be required to quiet the restlessness stirring beneath the roots. By the spring of 1883 the holler had grown so thick with silence that even the birds seemed reluctant to linger near the farmstead. Trails that once carried occasional peddlers or kin from Downridge now lay overgrown with briar and fern, as though the mountain itself conspired to keep the Harlands hidden. Yet isolation has its limits, and on a morning when dogwood petals drifted like pale snow across the yard, a stranger appeared at the edge of the clearing. He came on foot, leading a gaunt mule loaded with saddlebags bulging with tracts and a weather-beaten Bible. The man was tall and spare, dressed in black broadcloth gone green at the seams, a wide-brimmed hat shading a face burned dark by sun and conviction. Folks in the distant settlements called him Preacher Josiah Whitlock, a circuit rider who roamed the coves preaching hellfire to moonshiners and absolution to the despairing. He had heard the tales, lights flickering on the ridge without source, livestock found gutted with no mark of claw or tooth, children's laughter echoing from the woods long after dark, and something in the stories tugged at him like a fishhook in the soul. Elijah spotted him first from the barn loft, the preacher standing motionless at the fence line, head tilted as though listening to a sermon only he could hear. When Elijah stepped into the yard with the rifle cradled loose in his arms, Whitlock raised a hand in greeting rather than retreat. His eyes, pale blue and unflinching, swept the cabin, the outbuildings, the cluster of pale-faced children watching from the porch with their unsettling stares. The air around the preacher seemed to shimmer faintly, as if the holler's heaviness recoiled from him. "I've come to speak of salvation," Whitlock called, voice carrying clear over the buzz of spring insects. "And to warn against bargains made in darkness." Elijah's finger tightened on the trigger, but something stayed his hand, an instinct deeper than fear, the sense that this man carried a light the voices in the woods disliked. The children drew closer together on the steps, their ringed eyes fixed on the stranger with a mixture of curiosity and wariness. Even the dogs slunk beneath the porch rather than bark. Whitlock took another step forward, mule snorting behind him, and spoke directly to the family gathered in the doorway. "I feel it here," he said, pressing a hand to his chest. "An old hunger wearing the shape of promise. It whispers lies of strength through blood, but the wage is ruin." Thomas, standing just behind his father, felt the words strike like a mattock against stone, loosening the rebellion he had nursed since the attic discovery. Jacob's jaw worked soundlessly, while young Caleb edged farther back into the shadows. The women remained silent, faces averted, but their knuckles whitened on apron folds. Elijah found his voice at last, low and edged with warning. "We keep to ourselves. Best you do the same and ride on." Yet Whitlock did not move, his gaze lingering on the children as though seeing past their flesh to the twisting inheritance coiled within. The preacher's presence seemed to stir the very air, thinning the oppressive weight that had settled over the holler for years, and for a fleeting moment the woods behind the cabin fell utterly still, holding a collective breath against the intrusion of something it could not easily sway. By the summer of 1885 the Bloodline's alterations could no longer be dismissed as tricks of light or mountain fancy. The children born of the forced pairings had grown into youths whose very presence unsettled the livestock and bent the air around them like heat above a forge. Amos, Jacob's eldest at 10 years, stood a head taller than boys twice his age down in the settlements, his frame corded with muscle that seemed to swell and not overnight. His pale, ringed eyes now gleamed with a faint inner luminescence after dusk, visible even across the yard when he lingered too long at the ravine's edge. The change came upon him suddenly one August afternoon when the sun baked the holler into stillness. Elijah had sent Amos and 2 of the younger ones to clear a windfall blocking the upper trace, a stand of poplar toppled by spring floods. The boys tugged at branches no heavier than fence rails, yet when Amos gripped a fallen trunk to drag it aside, the bark splintered beneath his fingers as though rotted through. He heaved once, shoulders bunching, and the entire tree, thick as a rain barrel and 20 feet long, lifted clear of the ground and sailed 10 paces into the underbrush with a crash that echoed off the ridges like gunfire. The younger children scattered, whimpering, while Amos stood panting, hands bleeding sap where splinters had driven in, staring at his palms as if they belonged to a stranger. Word spread through the cabin that evening in hushed fragments. Thomas watched his nephew warily across the supper table, noting how the boy's shadow seemed darker than the others, stretching farther even when he sat still. Jacob said nothing, but his fork trembled against the tin plate. The girls, Lottie chief among them, began edging away when Amos passed, as though his nearness prickled their skin. Even Elijah, who had waited years for proof that the voices spoke true, felt the first creep of something colder than satisfaction when Amos met his gaze without flinching and the lamp flame guttered low though no draught stirred. In the weeks that followed, other manifestations ripened. Amos uprooted stumps that had defied the brothers' axes for seasons, split kindling with bare hands until the pile towered higher than the woodshed roof, and once, when a mangy bear raided the hog pen, drove the beast off with a roar that rattled the cabin windows and sent it crashing blindly into the laurel. Each feat left him drained yet strangely elated, eyes shining brighter, voice deepening to a timbre that vibrated in the chest like distant thunder. The younger children began mimicking him in small ways, bending saplings until they snapped, lifting water buckets that should have staggered them, yet none matched the raw force awakening in Amos. Preacher Whitlock's warnings echoed louder in the family's minds, though the man himself had not returned since spring. The Bloodline's mutations now strode among them in daylight, undeniable and growing, a power drawn up from the earth at the cost of every secret union Elijah had enforced. The voices praised Amos in Elijah's dreams, calling him the vessel at last, yet their tone carried a possessive edge that chilled even the old man's hardened heart. The boy's strength was not merely human, it carried the weight of something ancient testing the limits of borrowed flesh, flexing muscles it had waited generations to inhabit. The hollow watched in uneasy quiet as Amos grew taller still, his footfalls leaving prints deeper than any man's, the ground itself seeming to yield more willingly beneath him with each passing day. The autumn of 1886 arrived with a hush deeper than any the hollow had known, as though the mountain itself braced for what had been building beneath its skin for generations. Amos, now 11 but towering like a man full-grown, had become the axis around which the family turned. His strength no longer startled, it commanded. He hauled logs single-handed that required teams of mules before, split granite boulders for the chimney repair with blows from a sledge that rang like church bells across the ridges, and walked the fields at night without lantern or fear, his eyes casting their own faint glow that scattered the owls from their perches. Elijah watched him with a mixture of pride and growing dread, for the voices that once praised now spoke through the boy. Amos repeated their words in a voice not entirely his own, deeper, layered, as if several throats shared the same mouth. He told his grandfather of gates thinning beneath the ravine, of a shape older than the coal seams stirring in dreams of release. The other children gathered around him like supplicants, their own gifts sharpening in his wake, Lottie whispering to the wind until it carried her words to the far side of the ridge, the youngest lifting stones with a gesture rather than hands. The confrontation came on a night when the moon hung low and red, veiled by smoke from distant forest fires. Elijah, sleepless and tormented by visions of the entity rising unsatisfied, gathered the family in the yard and demanded one final pairing, Amos with Lottie, the strongest vessels, to seal the covenant once and for all. Thomas stepped forward at last, the rebellion forged in the attic now tempered into open defiance, his hand closing around the barrel of Elijah's rifle. Jacob joined him without a word, the years of silence breaking in a low growl of refusal. Even Caleb, trembling but resolute, stood between the older children and their grandfather's outstretched arm. Amos turned slowly toward the ravine, head cocked as though receiving fresh instruction. The ground trembled faintly beneath their feet, a vibration felt in the teeth more than heard, and from the laurel-choked depths rose a sound neither wind nor water, a low exhalation like something vast drawing breath after centuries of patience. The voices poured out then, no longer confined to Elijah's skull but filling the air itself, a chorus of welcome and hunger that drove the dogs to frenzy and cracked a windowpane in the cabin. Amos took one step toward the darkness, then another, his massive frame silhouetted against the moon. The earth split along an old fault line near the grave Elijah had dug years before, a fissure exhaling cold air that smelled of deep caves and older things. Shapes moved within it, tendrils of shadow that reached upward like roots seeking light. The boy halted at the edge, muscles taut, caught between the family's desperate cries behind him and the pull of what waited below. Chaos erupted in that suspended moment. Thomas fired the rifle skyward to break the spell, the report echoing like judgment. Jacob lunged for Amos, wrapping arms around a torso he could barely span. Lightning without clouds forked overhead, illuminating the ravine in stark white and revealing for an instant the suggestion of a colossal form uncoiling beneath the roots. The voices rose to a shriek that shattered the night, promising ruin for the broken bargain, and the ground buckled again as the entity lashed out in fury. The family scattered, some toward the cabin, others into the woods, while Amos roared in pain or ecstasy, blood running from his nose in black streams under the moon. The fissure widened with a sound like bones snapping, swallowing saplings whole, and from its depths poured a darkness that moved against the wind. The legacy Elijah had nurtured for a generation shattered in that single night, the Bloodline's power turning upon itself as the true source of the voices revealed its price at last, an eldritch hunger no mortal binding could ever sate.